Having me today. Today is a really important day for me because today is the first time that I'm actually speaking about my story in front of an audience. So thank you very much. And because of that, I am actually going to read a bit from my notes, if that's okay with you guys. My story today is about a disturbing reality, which has an equal disturbing outcome. My topic is the subtle nature of domestic violence, and the question that I'm going to attack today is the question that I always get asked: why didn't I know? I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a social worker or an expert in domestic violence. I'm just a woman with a story. I was 22 when I met my ex-husband on the side of a swimming pool. So yes, I am a swimmer, or past swimmer. I just arrived into Australia a couple months earlier. I couldn't speak much English at the time. So Home and Away and Neighbours became my favourite TV show because you didn't need to know much English to follow the story. So yes, my grandma comes from Home and Away and that. I'm here to tell you a story of love, a psychology trap disguised as love, one that millions of women and men fall into every year, and may even be your story. I don't look like a typical domestic survivor. I'm 47 years old, strong and 6 foot tall, with 2 crazy cats, a master's in NLP, and I'm closing a bachelor degree of psychology. And a few weeks ago, I gained a yellow belt in Krav Maga, which is a specialized self-defense in martial arts. So I'm very proud of that, which felt really awkward, but I'm really proud. I've spent most of my life in swimming pools as a professional swimmer, first in Germany in the 1980s, and I do have to say it was the clean side, not the dirty side. And then in Australia, and finally retiring at the Sydney Olympic Trials in 2000 at the age of 30 years. Once I retired as a professional swimmer, I opened up 2 successful businesses. I was married for almost 18 years to my ex-husband, and we have 2 wonderful and typical challenging children, and there's one of them here. I do love you. I am crazy in love with riding my motorbike, my adventure bike called Ruby. So she's a Suzuki V-Strom, and obviously she's red. And I drive a little Mini Cooper convertible called Pippa. So my first message to you is that domestic violence can happen to anyone. Every gender, all race, all religion, all income, and education level. It's everywhere. Domestic violence happens in intimate, interdependent, short and long-term relationships. In other words, in families, which should be the last place where we want to expect to find violence, which is one of the reasons why domestic violence isn't spoken of as much. Many people to this day still believe that domestic violence is only a physical abuse. You need to have a broken arm or bruises on your body or being killed by your abuser to be classed as a victim. However, abuse comes in many forms: emotional, verbal, financial, spiritual, just to name a few. My second message is that many of us assume domestic violence only happens to women, and typically between the age of 24 to 40 with small children, and that it's a women's issue. But it isn't the whole story. A few weeks ago, on the 27th of September 2017, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released the latest suicide data. On average, 8 Australian males will die today at their own hands. It is thought that more than half are directly attributed to relationship and family breakdown. So it's 8 men that are dying today. Sadly, too many women and mothers use the existing law to manipulate the system. And this is abuse too, just in a different form. I would have told you myself that I would be the last person on earth who would marry a man that becomes abusive in many years to come. But in fact, I'm a very typical woman because I knew nothing about domestic violence. Its warning signs, its patterns, and when it starts. I met my ex-husband while training in one of our swimming pools here in Brisbane. We started chatting and he offered me a lift home as I was riding this awful bicycle that I borrowed from one of my housemates, and I guess he felt sorry because it was way too small. He was funny, smart, athletic. He competed at a state level at the time in swimming and he knew his way around. But most of all, it all seems that he was loved and accepted by his fellow swimmers. We started dating and our sport was a huge connection between of us. I loved everything about him. I idolized him for a very long time. He became my rock, my all. However, over time, my English did improve, and I established myself as an independent woman. Looking back, I thought I was in love, but we were two people coming from opposite worlds, with different upbringing, different beliefs, different language barriers. One grew up in a major city where we had to defend ourselves, and the other one grew up in the rural Australia and growing up in boarding schools full of priests. For many years, I didn't know I was in an abusive relationship. The verbal and emotional abuse I experienced didn't happen every day. It started out occasionally and very subtle. Looking back, I think it started when I opened up my first business, because he wasn't the center of my attention then anymore. Often I didn't even think that there was anything wrong the way he spoke to me or what words he used to me, until much later into our relationship. The last 2 years of our marriage was the worst. The threats of suicide and emotional and verbal abuse became a daily norm. Despite what happened, I was sure we were going to live happily ever after, because I loved him and I thought he loved me too. I felt that this was just a huge bump in our road, and we even tried in our last year marriage counselling. I never thought of myself as a battered woman. Instead, I was a very strong woman who was in love with a troubled man. There are many reasons why a person becomes an abuser. Often because of low self-esteem, jealous, rush into a relationship. We got married 8 months after we met. Hypersensitive because they often take the slightest action as a personal attack. Or they create isolation to keep the victim completely centered on the abuser. And of course, personal disorders such as narcissistic, antisocial and personal disorder can come into play. All our reasons and stories an example, but still it's not an excuse for abuse. The interesting part on this, I was still happy to stay in this relationship. Or at least I think I was. I never thought to leave. I know it's crazy, isn't it? And this is the psychological trap disguised as love, as I took my marriage vows very seriously. I don't blame my ex-husband for everything. I had my part on this relationship too. It does take two to tango. Both victims and the abusers get something out of this situation. One just needs to understand what it is to make the healing. However, the final straw for me came when I discovered my husband broke our wedding vows. And for me, this was the breaking point. Because I've watched my mother for 30 years of marriage infidelity, and I swore to myself that I would never stay in a marriage where I wasn't wanted. Back then, I was really glad on what he did because it made an end to our suffering. Not just mine, his as well. I thought by ending our marriage we could move on and be there for our children, but unfortunately back then I didn't realize that the abuse would continue and escalate to what it is today. Did you know that 1 in 4 women, Australian women, experience at least one incident of domestic violence from the age of 15? and that 1 in 3 victims of family violence are males, which have been cited as sources in several statistics, including the ABC survey. And that 7 million children currently live in family violence where severe partner violence exists. 7 million. White Ribbon estimates the cost of domestic violence against women in the year 2017 to $21.7 billion, and men have not been added into that statistic. What most people don't realize, including myself, abuse often continues even after separation. Over 70% of domestic violence murders happens after the victim ended the relationship because the abuser has nothing left then. Often outcomes including long-term stalking, even after the abuser remarries, denial of financial resources, and manipulation of the family courts to terrify the victim and their children. So I broke my silence of domestic violence only 6 months ago, after being dragged through another magistrate court, which ended up in High Court, having dealt with endless abusive texts and emails and continual harassment by Centrelink and the CSA, having done many audits and even the appeals tribunal. I just got to a point where I had enough. Only my family or close family friends knew about what's going on. So I decided at that point, when my son turns 18, at the moment he's still 15, I would pack up my belongings and ride my motorbike around the world to celebrate part of that freedom. What I didn't expect at the time was that my son would tell me that he wants to come with me. I mean, just imagine 1 year with your 18-year son, which is pretty amazing, but I think that's a challenge in itself. So the mom and son adventure was born. You may ask, why motorbike riding? One of my early childhood memories was I've always wanted to learn how to ride a motorbike, but I've always said I would never do that until my children grew up to a certain age that if something happens to me, they still could go on. What I didn't realize was the passion I would develop for motorbike riding, or the freedom and the peace that motorbike riding brings to me. I forget everything when I'm on the bike. The drama at home, my ex, his wife, the children, finances, my mother, my father. I just become one with the road and the environment, which is a beautiful feeling to have. So if it was up to me, I would be on a motorbike right now. One of my other passions is to end domestic violence. Having gone through my experience, I always wanted to help others. I just did not know how to. So when the mom and son adventure was born, it became quite quickly clear that we have a powerful tool to deliver a message. And this was the reason why we decided to create a domestic violence charity to help both genders and their families. So we're talking about grandparents and their children as well. The domestic violence campaign is very different to most of them. It's gender neutral by offering offenders and victims assistance to relieve the cause and not just treat the symptom. We will spread the message of hope and practical resources on the back of the motorbike directly to rural and regional Australia in 2018, so in a few months. This campaign is still in its early stages and there's a lot of work to be done before this can be launched. So if you feel you can help us with different resources such as business, financial strategies, legal or fundraising opportunities, please consider in contacting us. There is just so much to do. Whilst I've never experienced physical harm, we tend to stereotype victims with these grisly headlines of self-destructive women or men, damaged goods. The question is, why did she or he stay? It is the code for some people. It's her or his fault for staying. as if victims decide to marry someone who's about to choose this outcome. Since coming forward with my story in establishing the mom and son adventure, I've heard many stories from males and females who also got out, who learned an invaluable lesson of what has happened, who rebuilt their lives as employees, wives, husbands, mothers, fathers, live lives completely free of violence, just like me. I'm now with a very kind and gentle man who loves motorbiking, not quite as much as I do. And I still have 2 crazy cats. But I will never again have someone telling me he loves me and abuses me as well. Right now you might be thinking, wow, this is fascinating, or wow, how stupid was she? But the whole time I've actually been talking about you. Statistically speaking, there are probably several people in here listening to me right now who are currently being abused, or who were abused as children, or who are the abusers themselves. The person right next to you could be one of those. Abuse could affect your daughter, your son, your sister, your brother, or your best friend right now. I was able to end my own crazy story by breaking the silence. I'm still breaking the silence today. It's my way of helping others, and it's my final request to you. Don't be a bystander. Speak up when you see abuse. Do something about it. Talk about what you have heard here today. Abuse thrives in silence. You have the power to end domestic violence simply by shining the light on it. Recognize the early symptoms and the continuous interference and descaling it. Show victims a safe way out. Thank you.